faces de você me lembro mais.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. I live in England now, and so 15-minute delay makes me nervous. So please have a seat. My name is Francisco Ferreira, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Raquel Fernandez for her LACEA presidential address now. Raquel is the Silva Professor in the Department of Economics at New York University. She's a member of the NBER, the CEPR, the IZA, BRED, and of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Working Group. She's previously been a tenured professor at the London School of Economics, Boston University, and Oslo University. She has served as the director of the public policy program of the CEPR. She was a vice president of the American Economic Association and the president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association during 2020 and 2021. And she's giving her presidential lecture this year because she really wanted to do it in person. And she's connecting remotely, but that was the reason for the lecture to be this year. She founded WELAC, the Women Economists in Latin America and the Caribbean, as a subcommittee of LACEA and continues to direct it today. She's also the co-director of the NBR's Inequality and the Macroeconomy Group, a member of the advisory and scientific committees of various institutions, including the International Economic Association, the Barcelona School of Economics, and RIDGE. She's a fellow of the Econometric Society, the recipient of numerous National Science Foundation grants, of a Spencer Fellowship from the National Academy of Education, and has been a National Fellow of the Hoover Institute and a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. Raquel's work is broad, spans a number of areas, and her broad research interests include sovereign debt, culture and economics, development and gender issues, macroeconomics and inequality, and political economy. And she has made very substantive contributions to all of these areas, publishing extensively in the leading journals. So because we're a little bit late, we'll have about 50 minutes for the session. And without further ado, over to you, Raquel.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I need to make sure you can hear me. I don't know what else to say.
So, Raquel, can you hear me? Raquel?
¿Me pueden escuchar?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, you can?
Yeah, so
Okay.
please go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Can you see the slides? Sorry, can you see the slides? I'm not having much luck here. I cannot hear anything.
Yes,
so,
we can see the slides as well. Everything's working.
Okay, if somebody doesn't tell me whether to go ahead, I won't know. Maybe you could interrupt me, Chico, and tell me everything is fine and I should just go ahead and talk.
Raquel, I don't know if you can hear me, but everything is fine and you can go ahead. Raquel, can you hear me?
Yes, Raquel, please go ahead.
Can I go ahead and talk? Because I'm getting
Yes.
zero feedback from you. It would be very helpful.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
I
Raquel.
should talk. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. So now that you can both see and hear me, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very envious of you being there in person. I need to reassure, first of all, Chico, that I was not trying to depose him, and I don't plan to come back to be president, but that I am sick, so I unfortunately could not make it, despite very, very, very much wanting to be there. So I'm going to talk to you today about universal basic income, mostly based on a paper that's joint with Diego Darwich. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and try to do that. So first of all, what's universal basic income? It's a cash transfer that's not conditional, that allows people to choose how they wish to use that cash, and obviously should be universal, and to make sense, substantial. Now, this is an increasingly popular policy proposal. It's proposed to help with the inadequacies of the current social safety net. We saw this very much during the pandemic. The growing inequality, lower intergenerational mobility, with fears of massive loss of jobs due to robotization and automation in the future. But if we were to ask what are the consequences of universal basic income, we wouldn't really have a very good answer. In particular, we really have evidence that only comes from very partial, short-term programs, mostly in developing countries, some of them in developed countries, but none of which are able to ask what are the longer run and what are the larger scale consequences of UBI. So what I'm going to do here is to show you what happens when you use a quantitative model as an inexpensive test of universal basic income. So very briefly, I should warn you, this is macro. So very briefly, let me give you an outline of what I'm going to do. So I'm going to develop, again, at least sketch out, a general equilibrium life cycle Ayagari model that is with imperfect markets, but for capital and for insurance. There's going to be uninsured wage shocks, but on top of that, there's going to be endogenous intergenerational links. That is, links between parents and their kids that come both from parental investment when the kids are at home to build their child's skills, and parental transfers when the kid is about to leave home, which is supposed to capture some idea of all the important monetary transfers that parents do to children during their lifetime. I'm going to estimate this using household data. I would love to do this with a Latin American data set as well. That's going to be close to the year 2000. So whenever I'm talking about prices, you should interpret those prices as being 2000 year prices. And it's going to include a progressive tax function that includes deductions, credits, cash transfers. And then I'm going to validate the model, showing you that the model is in line with small-scale, short-run empirical evidence that we have in a variety of areas, particularly areas that really matter to us to evaluate how well universal basic income does, and that the model matches well also on-target moments that are related to inequality, where inequality is key because among one of the many things that you want universal basic income to do is that it's basically redistributing a large amount of income from one sector of society to another. Despite being universal, it has to be paid for. So the policy that I then will introduce in the model is UBI. And the key thing that I want to try to understand and leave you with some understanding is, why do we get the welfare results that we get? So let me start with a very brief preview of the results. So we're going to be looking at giving everybody, or every adult, sorry, $8,000 a year. That would be around $12,000 in 2020 prices. And so $8,000 in 2000 prices. And what we're going to find is that every cohort is going to lose as a result of this policy. This is an overlapping generations model, so there are going to be many cohorts alive at any moment in time. And in particular, across adult agents who are alive when this policy is introduced, the losses are going to be on average of 6% in terms of consumption equivalence units. In the new steady state, we're going to have much larger losses of the order of 22%. And we are going to have falling inequality. But as you can see, that falling inequality does not compensate for the welfare losses. What we find is that UBI is going to decrease labor supply, skills, education, savings, all on top of inequality. And that when we think about what is producing these results, the dynamics of capital and these intergenerational linkages are going to play key roles in the welfare results. So this is what I really would like to emphasize, along with the Merlezian style decomposition. So a Merlezian style decomposition is going to show that even if we were to give agents a small amount of money, that is in the longer run going to decrease the welfare of all. So let me try to explain these results and also try to explain what that implies, if anything, for redistribution more generally. So the model, as I said, is a general equilibrium Iagari model in which people live for 20 periods. So these are going to be, each period is going to be 4 years. So that's going to be 80 years in total. There's going to be uncertainty in complete markets. There's going to be a whole host of endogenous outcomes. There's going to be wages that are going to depend on age, education, skills, and shocks. And in the background, there's going to be an aggregate firm that combines capital, college, and non-college labor. The endogenous intergenerational links come about because people are not infinitely lived. People have kids, parents care about their kids, and parents invest in their child's skills, as well as transferring to them a monetary amount right when they become independent. Why might there be a role for government intervention here? First of all, we have imperfect capital and insurance markets. And second of all, we have something that makes a lot of sense, which is the inability of parents to write contracts with children. So in particular, children cannot ask parents to invest more in their skills or give them a larger monetary transfer and promise to pay them back later. There are no contracts that allow them to do so. So let me go quickly over the model. So here's our timeline. J is going to be the period age, so 1 through 20, and at the beginning of period 21, kids die. The agent dies. And when they're born, they have an age of 0. They live with their parents. While they're living with their parents is investing in their skills. At J equals 5, which would correspond to a calendar age of 16, the child becomes independent. They choose whether they'd like to go to college or to work. College is costly, but it has some returns to it. Then comes a huge section of life, which goes from either period 5, if you haven't gone to college, or from period 6, if you've gone to college, all until the age of retirement, which is at age 64, in which you both work, earn wages, and have a child exogenously at age 28. And when you have that child, you're investing in that child's skills. And then, as I said, you're going to be doing a transfer. When you retire, you live from your savings and your Social Security. And then you die with probability 1 at the end. Now, how does universal basic income change anything here? Well, you could use your universal basic income. You would start getting it when you become an adult. So right before you're deciding, do you want to go to college or not, you could use it to help fund college. You can use it to help smooth shocks while you're working. And you could use it as an additional source of income when you're retired. So I'm not going to take you through any equations. I will give you only one, just so that you get a better of a feel of the model. So this is a model that, so here's let me just go directly. This is a value function for an agent who has some age J, and their state variable at that point is their assets, theta, which is simply the vector of their skills, their education, which is either college or non-college, a productivity shock, mu, and if they're in a period in which they're having kids at home, also the state vector of their child's skills. They come into the period with all of these state vectors, and then they're going to be maximizing their flow utility and the discounted value of their expected value, the discounted expected valuation of their future. They're doing that choosing consumption, saving, how many hours to work, and how much resources to invest in the skills of their children. They do that subject to a budget constraint. Their budget constraint is simply labor earnings, wealth, including the earnings from wealth. And from this, we're going to be subtracting taxes, which are going to be paid on labor earnings, on capital, and on consumption. What are their labor earnings? Their labor earnings are the hours that they choose to work, the unit wage of the education group that they belong to, college or non-college, and then the number of efficiency units that they have, which is a function of their education, but also a function of their skills and of the productivity shock. They're subject to a borrowing constraint. They're not allowed to borrow more than some natural borrowing limit. They face a constraint on how many hours they can work, and that's about it there. What I would like to show you next is simply what that production of skills looks like. So when you are producing next period's child skills, indicated by this prime here, it's going to be a function of the current period's child skills, the parental skills, and the parental investments. So this is where investing in your kid matters, because that investment is some amount of money. There's also a stochastic element, which is a shock. These are all aggregated via CES, and these coefficients, the reason that they have J's on them is because it depends on the age of the child. So we know that children learn more, there's greater plasticity when they're younger than when they're older. All that is going to be reflected in these coefficients. The last thing I'm going to tell you is that when parents make a transfer to their kids, what they're going to do is they're going to be maximizing their own continuation value. They're going to think about how much they want to give their kids this A hat, and then they're going to give it to their kids so as to maximize their own continuation value and the discounted value of their child's utility, where this delta is not a discount factor in terms of time, but it's a discount factor in terms of altruism. This thing has always been there. It's just been hidden in that valuation function. We have a fairly complicated model in that kids can, if they choose to go to college, they can borrow at subsidized rates. They can work while in college. They get a draw of school taste. That draw depends on parents' education, and that's going to help to determine whether or not they want to go to college. Okay, so that's the main, say, vision of the model. We have CES preferences, Cara preferences. We have an aggregate production function in the background that takes capital and labor, where this H is simply an agglomeration using the CES of high school labor, which is this naught, H naught, and college labor, which is this H1. And then it's all put together via a Cobb-Douglas. And again, capital markets, agents trade only in risk-free bonds. There's a wedge between borrowing and savings in that interest rate, and there's natural borrowing limits. There's perfect competition. And what we do is we solve for the stationary distribution of this economy. So to do that, we need to estimate this economy using data. And what we do is we use as a guiding principle that the agents in the model are going to represent a household. We use a variety of micro data sets. Let me just tell you a few of them, a few things that we do. One is, what do labor taxes look like? Well, this is the after-tax labor income. So here's an agent's labor income. Here's the taxes that they're paying on labor income. And it's a function which has two parameters, lambda and tau y. This is based on Feldstein. It's been popularized by Benabou. It's a progressive labor tax function. You should think about tau y as telling you how progressive it is. You should think about lambda as telling you what the average labor tax is. In addition to this, we add an omega, which is transfers. That's going to help fit better how much low labor income agents get. And of course, when we introduce universal basic income, we'll also have B there. To think about this, we target the ratio of government expenditures to output and the ratio of variance of pre to post-tax total income. We also, as I said, have taxes on interest income from your assets, consumption, in addition to labor taxation. Labor productivity depends on your cognitive skills. The way it depends on that depends on your level of education. So this is a parameter which is indexed by whether you're college or non-college. It follows an AR1. We add superstar states, and I won't discuss the out-of-work states shocks because we don't really need to use them for what I'm talking about right now. The way that we think about these superstar states, we use them to match the high degree of wealth and income inequality, which are very hard to match otherwise. In particular, we use them to match the income share of the top 5%, the wealth share of the top 1%, and the wealth share of the top 0.1%. We end up having log preferences over consumption and a Frisch elasticity of a half. How much do parents care about their kids is given by this delta. And the way that we're going to end up estimating, everything in the end is estimated jointly, but I guess the best way to think about it is that we're matching the intergenerational persistence of income in the rank fashion of Chetty et al. 2014. So there's a whole bunch of external parameters that we don't have to estimate. A lot of them having to do with the borrowing, the taxes, the intergenerational persistence of initial skills, and the aggregate production function. And then things that are matched internally. School taste is, as you can see, is a bit more complicated. It depends on not only your cognitive, but also your non-cognitive skills. So we're going to be matching that internally. The superstar shock, which we already discussed, and the labor income tax, which we already discussed as well. Now, we validate the stationary state of this economy, and we can validate it using non-targeted moments that we think are important to think about universal basic income. So one would be investments in kids. So we look at how well it does about annual expenditures on children, but also by ratios of parental income, middle to bottom and top to bottom. We can look at intergenerational mobility as measured by the probability of children who are born in the bottom 20%, exiting the bottom 20%. And then we can look at all sorts of things related to college, things that relate to loans, which I won't go into given time, but also the income ratio by education, how going to college depends on parental income, parental transfers as a share of labor income, etc. And as you can see from all of these, we do pretty well on all these non-targeted moments. This is what our labor income looks like. The model is in red, the data is in blue, and given that these are not targets, we do fairly well in having the model match labor income by quintiles. These are the wealth quintiles, and as you can see, we don't get as much in the top as in the data, but importantly, when you think about these policies, we do very well in terms of thinking that basically your bottom quintile has no wealth in the United States. And we do a very good job at that for that in the second and third quintile. The other way that we validate the model is using micro studies. So there's a paper on lottery winnings on labor incomes. So Golosov and his co-authors, they have a working paper, so it's fairly recent, that studies the effect of winning the lottery of at least $30,000 on labor earnings. And what they find is that you see very large and immediate effects during the first 5 years after winning a lottery. And basically, labor earnings on average fall for $2.34 for every $100 of post-tax lottery winnings. There's a whole literature that looks at the non-labor income elasticity of labor supply. And then there's a nice paper by Dahl and Lochner that uses changes in earned income tax credit, where parents got $1,000 more on average, say, to examine what effect that had on the reading and math scores of children. So we look at all these things. I don't have time to show you. We look at all these things in the model by running in the model, small scale, that is, prices and taxes are not affected. Short run, and for skill formation, targeted, that is, targeted to people who earn less than $30,000 a year in the United States, of the effects of giving them either lottery winnings, give them an extra $1,000 per year to think about their labor supply, and give them an extra $1,000 per year while their kid lives with them to see what happens to their cognitive skills. And on the whole, for these three things, we do very well. So now let me turn to the main topic of interest, which is to look at what is the effect of UBI in such an economy. As I said in my intro, we're going to be looking at an annual transfer of $8,000 per year to an adult. We're going to assume that the government's budget must be balanced in every year. I didn't really talk enough about the government budget. What the government is doing is paying for any sort of transfers, paying for the Social Security transfers as well, but also there's going to be some unmatched amount of government expenditures, and that was a target in the estimation. So throughout, we're never going to change how many other things the government is doing other than transferring to people money like defense or whatever else. Okay, so those type of expenses are still there, and they're going to be held constant throughout all the exercises. So how are we going to pay for UBI? We're going to be adjusting that average labor tax. That's probably the easiest way to think about it. In each period, that's why you see a T subscript, to make sure the budget balances. You could think of other implementations, of course. You could think about having UBI replace current redistribution programs, either by getting rid of lump sum transfers that you had before, or getting rid of the progressivity of the tax rate and having a linear tax, a proportional tax, and then letting Lambda adjust. You could assume that it reduces administrative expenditures and find at what level, how much it would have to reduce expenditures in the public sector in order for welfare to become positive. And let me just tell you that, since I won't be able to show you this, it's going to be by a gigantic amount. And you can have it funded by a consumption tax rather than labor tax. And here, that choice does matter in a way that I will take 2 seconds to explain at the end. Okay, let me just go on. So here is the introduction of a universal basic income policy. It happens at t=0. And as you can see, it has pretty dramatic effect on aggregate variables. GDP falls, capital falls, and labor falls, this composite labor. Basically, half of the GDP fall is due to the fall in capital, which is very steep. It's the yellow line. And the other half comes from labor, which would be a combination of hours worked, how many people are going to college, and the skills that individuals have. Prices, in terms of interest rates, high school wages, etc., move in the opposite directions as you would expect them to. Everything is measured in percentages relative to the initial steady state. I should hasten to add, you see a large change in tax revenue composition. Labor income becomes much more important. Parental transfers, which is this blue line here, goes down. Skill investment decreases. The share of agents who end up going to college falls. It's about 4 something percentage points. Labor productivity falls about 1.5 percentage points. Large falls in media and long-lasting, and hours worked both by college and high school agents. On the positive side, we see far less dependency of the decision of going to college on, or how much is invested in children, on parental income. So these would be coefficients, deviations from the coefficients of a regression of going to college on parental income and the amount of skill expenditures on parental income. The one on skill expenditures, interestingly, decreases, but then it goes back to where it was before. Income inequality is measured by the variance of after-tax income, of the log of after-tax income falls dramatically. Intergenerational mobility increases. Both the rank coefficient becomes, this is the negative sign of it, becomes smaller, and the probability of a child exiting the bottom 20% really goes up. The wealth share of the those people below the 60% as well goes up. So I don't have time to, I'm not going to, well, let me very briefly mention this. I do think it's interesting. If you were to look at the distributional effects of DBI, the blue is upon initial impact. The blue is the initial steady state. The red is right upon impact. So for that first generation who's born with this. And the green is the new steady state. And what you can see is that after-tax labor income barely changes for the bottom quintile. There are some important changes for other quintiles, and particularly for the top quintile. Investment in child skill, again, doesn't change very much for the bottom, and it doesn't change very much at the top. Where it changes is in the middle, for the middle 3 quintiles. And then if you were to ask who goes to college, and you distinguish people now between those who received 0 transfers from their parents and those who received positive transfers, we see less dependency on transfers than we did previously, as you can see by the red and the green line being greater than the blue, whereas the people who go to college and were receiving transfers from their parents, they are less likely to go to college than before. In terms of looking more closely at welfare, what I've plotted here is in consumption equivalent units and percentages by each cohort. So when this happens at t=0, there's a cohort who's just going to die the next period. And so you'll have 20 cohorts who are alive. And here you see their welfare fate. And then you have cohorts who are going to becoming online over time. And this, we just stopped arbitrarily here. And as you can see, there's welfare losses on average for every single cohort, but particularly large losses for cohorts that are yet to be born. If you were to look at adults at t=0, which is important because after all, these would be the agents who would get to vote on this. These would be the agents, you might argue, that already care about their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, albeit discounted by that altruism parameter. So you could argue whether it's the correct discount or not the correct discount. You see that both college, the yellow, and green, the high school agents, no matter what age they are, when this policy is introduced, they're made worse off. Again, this is a forward-looking thing. It's a shock, there's a policy introduced, and then we can look at their welfare. If you were to ask how many agents are in favor of UBI, we would have about 27% of agents in favor of UBI. So really what we wanted to do was to understand why this is the case. I'm going to, again, in the interest of time and losing my voice, talk only about a few of these. So let me only very briefly do number one. So number one, what I have here is simply, it's a lot to absorb, is simply this, whatever variable it says on top of the panel. Here's welfare for children, here's welfare for adults, or here it could be welfare for steady state. It depends on what we're looking at. Here you see we produce the results that I just talked about. Skill investment goes down, parental transfers go down, labor productivity, college goes down, huge decline in the capital stock, large decline in hours worked, large decline in income inequality, wages go down, the interest rate goes up, and we already went over these results. So now I want to just look at them in a few components. So the first thing I'm going to do is to go to this column which says no, no, no. And that's not me just saying no, no, no. That's saying that we're going to not have a balanced budget. We're not going to be in the long run, and we're not going to have general equilibrium effects. And obviously, this is a great policy. If you could give $8,000 per year to every adult and not have to pay for it, everyone's going to be thrilled. In particular, the adults are going to be thrilled. Their children are going to be thrilled. It's not long run, but it still affects their kids. And the reason it affects their kids, so now it's children, not steady state, is because there's going to be increased skill investment and skilled parental transfers. And these are all the great effects you would have of UBI if you didn't have to fund it. The next thing we do is to ask what happens if you do have to fund it. Again, you only give it to that one generation, not all adults, one cohort of adults. And you ask that cohort of adults to pay for it, period by period, in a balanced budget manner, again, without any general equilibrium effects. And as you can see already here, you have negative welfare effects for adults and negative welfare effects for their children. What you see happening right away is that you've had a large decrease both in hours worked and in capital. So we see the effects of taxation on this. Lastly, or penultimately, we can allow this to be long run. And instead of having to bear the burden by themselves of paying for UBI, all cohorts at every point in time are being taxed. It's not each cohort paying at each moment in time for its own UBI, but rather there's cross-sectional taxation. So that in some sense is relieving the tax burden. On the other hand, we need to pay for UBI for all adults. And as you can see, the welfare consequences, both for adults and in the steady states, are much worse. And a lot of it is coming, again, from a decrease in hours worked, which is not that dramatic compared to before, but you really see a dramatic effect on the capital stock, on parental transfers, and also on investment in children skills. This is this is now the first time you see a substantial effect on income inequality. So unless you're going to give UBI to all, just doing it for one generation or just having taxes is not going to have much of an effect on inequality. And lastly is a line that you've already seen, which is the full general equilibrium effects of UBI, which in this case help to mitigate somewhat the adverse effects. You can see that instead of losing 28, they now lose 22 in the long run. Instead of losing 7, they now lose 6. Why is that? Because because capital falling so much is going to increase the interest rate, which is going to therefore give incentives to save more than before. And that ends up having an effect on all the variables that you see in the model. Okay, let me just make sure I'm keeping time. So if we want to understand the steady state welfare effects, they have to arise only from 2 channels. Either it's evaluation of being an adult, given assets, cognitive skills, and your taste for college. Either that's changed, or it's the distribution over these states, the A's, the thetas, the epsilons, that's changed. And of course, both things have really happened. So one way to gauge the importance of parents, because parents are what determine your A, your theta, and therefore, by their own education, your taste for college. One way to gauge is to say, suppose there was no change in the value function. Suppose it's just as good to be born in one steady state as in the other steady state. It's the distribution over these states that has changed. That gives us, just changing the distribution, gives us a welfare loss in the steady state of over 10%, which is close to 50% of all the total steady state welfare losses. So basically, parents investing less in their kids' skills, giving them less transfers, is what's leading to a very different steady state distribution with very important effects for welfare. The alternative decomposition, which is to keep the distribution fixed, but now allow the valuation, gives you a large change as well. About 56% of total losses come from the changes in the value, even if we were to keep the distribution fixed. So both what happens in the new steady state and your state variables, about where the value, the distribution over the state variables, contribute largely to your long-run welfare. Okay, that said, what I want to do next is to look at 2 things. One, how much does it matter that skills are endogenous, and how much does the capital market matter? So to think about endogenous skills, what we do is we replace these endogenous skills that we have in our model by a transition matrix that gives each child a draw from the original steady state distribution of skills that corresponds to their parents' education and skill level. In other words, if you tell me your parents' education and skill level, I will tell you your probability of having particular levels of skills. And when we replace the model with this, and we find the new steady state of this model, given now with this transition matrix rather than endogenous skills, even though we don't re-estimate the models, it does a really good job of fitting the same moments as before. So it's not like it gives us a crazy model. The other experiment we do, and I'll tell you the results in a second for the first and the second, is we replace the endogenous capital market. And what we do is we keep the aggregate capital stock and the interest rate constant at the original steady states of the pre-UBI benchmark model. So capital tax revenue in particular would be unchanged. Now, by design, this model is exactly observationally equivalent to the steady state of the pre-UBI benchmark model, which had an endogenous capital market. And no, it's not that we're shutting down the ability of agents to borrow or save. They can still borrow and save, but that, when they do so, that does not affect the aggregate capital stock, and it does not affect the interest rate. So this is a way to ask how important are these channels. So the first row that you see here is simply the benchmark model repeated all over again for the whole set of variables that we've seen before. The second one, which is called fixed skills, is that exogenous transition matrix. And what you can see there, let's just go straight to the welfare results since we don't have time, is that steady state welfare, the losses are halved, whereas the welfare of adults barely changes. So the fact that skills are endogenous is really important for the welfare results that we obtain. Not very much for adults, which is not surprising. It takes time for skills to be affected. Each cohort is going to have worse and worse skills over time. And so shutting that down and putting an exogenous transition matrix doesn't really affect adults that much, although they do care about their kids, grandkids, etc. These improvements just don't mean enough to them, but it does make a big difference in the long run. What makes an even larger difference, though, is getting rid of the capital market and putting in fixed capital. And there, what you can see is that welfare studies, the steady state welfare losses are 1/5 of what they used to be. And the welfare of adults is actually goes up. Let me not talk about the last line. Let me just tell you what this means. This means that what's playing a large role, let's just talk about the capital part because we've talked about skills already, is that before, when we had that fall in capital, it really mattered. And one of the reasons it mattered was not only because it mattered to wages. We got very negative effects in partial equilibrium. So it's not because of their effect on wages. It's not because of the effect on interest rates, because again, we got very negative effects. But it's actually because when the capital stock falls, we are getting an important effects on the amount of taxation we can get from capital. And that taxation that we lose from capital has to be made up by taxing labor even more heavily, which then just reinforces the negative effects on labor supply and skill investment that were already present because of having to pay for UBI in the first place. So the other thing I want to talk about, and I'm almost done with this, is to say, well, let's do this in a different way. Is it because this is really expensive? It's $8,000. It's huge per adult. Let's give people a small transfer. So, and in particular, one of the reasons to do this is because there's a large public finance literature that suggests that there's too little redistribution in the United States. I'm not going to disagree with that, but I am going to show you what we get here. What we're going to do then is to introduce a small UBI by permanently increasing the amount of lump sum transfers that people are getting by $100 annually for all adults. This is a computational model, so if you choose it too small, you won't be able to compute anything. You need too much of a fine grid. So $100 is kind of the minimum. We finance this just like before via balanced budget, changing the average labor tax in each period. And we're going to proceed the same way that people do in public finance by looking at mechanical behavioral effects in partial equilibrium and total effects in general equilibrium. So let me show you those results, again, fairly quickly. What is a mechanical effect? Mechanical effect says, okay, you're giving people UBI, you're changing taxes, but we're not going to let labor hours work change. We're not going to allow skill investment, parental transfers to change, nothing that's endogenous. Everything is going to be taken up in terms of consumption. You will either consume more, those 100, or you will consume less because labor taxes came in, or something in between. And as you can see, the mechanical effect, if you didn't allow anything to change, the mechanical effect of this small UBI is positive for both for adults and for steady state welfare. Suppose now we were to do the same thing, give this to one cohort, but now allow for behavioral changes, but only for one cohort. So again, this is a cohort. It has to finance UBI each period. It is the only one getting this UBI of $100. The effects, again, are positive. There's no effect in the long run because other cohorts are not going to be affected. And you can see there's effect on hours, on skills, etc. This was in partial equilibrium. It was short run. Now we can do the same exercise and do long run partial equilibrium. That is, everybody gets this $100. and it must be financed. And that's where you start to see the negative effects, both for adults and in a steady state. And as you can see, again, you're seeing a large effect. This is relative, everything is relative, a little bit over half of a percentage point in the capital stock. And you're seeing an effect, less, but still an effect, on hours worked. Sorry, on hours worked, I'm in the wrong place, on hours worked. Unless here, when you do general equilibrium, it actually does not help to mitigate. Things become worse, both for the welfare of adults and for the welfare in the steady state. If you were to do the same exercises as we did previously and shut down skills and shut down capital, everything turns positive, both for the welfare of adults in the welfare of adults and the welfare in the steady state. So in particular, shutting down skills matter, but what really matters seems to be shutting down the capital stock. So let me conclude with some lessons that we can draw from this. And I'm going to use that moment to also talk about consumption taxation and about other forms of redistribution. So what we've done is to use a model to evaluate universal basic income. It's a general equilibrium, overlapping generations, incomplete market model. I didn't talk about out-of-work shocks, but we have distortionary taxes and endogenous intergenerational links. The validation exercise shows that the model does a good job on key moments and on elasticities that matter to evaluate UBI. And that UBI generates average negative welfare consequences for every cohort and very large losses in the long run, despite decreasing inequality in an important fashion. Capital dynamics and endogenous intergenerational links played key roles in these results. If one didn't have endogenous intergenerational links, welfare losses would be half. Adult welfare, on the other hand, would not be changed very much. But as you saw, and let me repeat, an exogenous aggregate capital stock and a constant interest rate yields smaller long-run welfare losses and actually leaves adults better off. Now, does the Milesian analysis imply that the US has the right amount of redistribution? After all, we're making people worse off even with just $100. And the answer is no. And one thing that we do is in the paper, and there's no time to show you, is that if we were to increase labor tax progressivity, that is change tau y, how progressive the tax is, by 0.01, and allow instead lambda to change to keep tax revenue unchanged. So no UBI, just this change in the tax function, then adults would gain, although we would still see, I have to say, losses in the long run. So it matters what sort of changes one's making to achieve greater redistribution. And lastly, that UBI financed by consumption taxation is welfare improving on average from all cohorts. But it's really important to note one thing that we show in our paper, which is this is not because UBI is so great, but rather because consumption taxation is great. So if we do the shift that we see in UBI, the increase in consumption taxation that we see in UBI, and we were to put it in our economy without UBI and allow labor taxation to go down accordingly, that has greater positive welfare consequences. And that shows you that the welfare improvements don't come from UBI, but rather from consumption taxation. Lastly, now this is truly lastly, there's some lessons from here. I think that the lessons point to potential problems with evaluating policy changes solely from evidence derived from short run and very partial equilibrium settings for small groups. I think they also serve as a caution to the tax and the macro literature that ignore, to the extent that they ignore physical and human capital accumulation. And what we've shown is that putting in physical and human capital accumulation is key to getting these very negative welfare results. And consequently, it would be wise not to ignore them when doing macro evaluations of macro policies or tax policies. Okay, let me end there. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's questions. I'm going to leave that to the chair.
Thank you very much, Raquel. I think we have time for maybe one round of short questions, 2 or 3 questions if there are any. So let me look. There's one question. Yes, sir. I don't know if there is a microphone. There. Yeah. Other microphone. Can people please turn the microphone on? Why don't you come here and ask the question?
Hello? Raquel, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I think it was very insightful. However, I have one question regarding public goods in the model, because I guess that every single good in the model is a private and given the situation. Wouldn't it be possible if there is an externality in the goods traded and use that taxation in order to provide for the actual given finance to finance this type of universal basic income would be a welfare improvement that actually would not take the steady state into a lower situation, or actually could be even improvement in the welfare of the generations? Do you think that if the complexity adds another level, you know, it's a very complicated model, but if we would add this type of complexity, taking into account maybe public goods or even externalities in the consumption goods, given the taxation of those externalities, or even, I don't know, maybe a permits trading function to try to finance the universal basic income, do you think it could actually improve the welfare instead of diminishing the amount of steady state and diminishing the welfare over generations? Thank you.
Thanks. Any final questions? Okay, if not, okay, Marcela.
Raquel?
Yeah.
Hi, Marcela here. Thanks for the presentation. It was great. I learned a lot. As you said at the beginning, part of the discussion has also been whether to perhaps introduce this to replace parts of social security systems that may be distortionary. So I was wondering whether you have any insight into what if we thought of this as something that comes in exchange, in particular for contributory social security systems, and specifically for contexts such as Latin America, where we have this very high informality, and that seems to also be related to these costs to labor related to the contributions.
Thank you, Marcela. Let me ask a very quick question of my own, and then we'll go to Raquel for her last comments. So Raquel, thanks a lot for that. Just 2 quick questions of clarification. One, you have perfect competition in goods markets, and so you don't have big rents or monopoly profits. So to match the top wealth and income distribution of the United States, if I understood correctly, you introduced what you called this superstar productivity shock, which probably means that people were very, very highly productive at the top of the distribution. Does that play any role? Of course, when you then tax those people more, we lose a lot. Whereas if they were getting their wealth from rents instead of being hugely productive, might that make any difference? And the last question is, can the hours that people reduce work in be used to invest in their children? So I think you have this human capital production function where there are investments, there might also be time investments. Could these single mothers who are working less spend more time with their children, and might that have any effect? So just those three questions, and over to you for your final answers, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chico, and thanks to everyone for their questions. Let me just try to do them in order. In terms of public goods, I mean, to the extent that those unmodeled government expenditures are public goods, and to the extent that one can think about them as being giving separable utility, gains to people, obviously everything would be the same. But that's not what really we're really thinking about. I think you're thinking about externalities, etc. And of course, externalities can change things. Again, you would kind of ask yourself, why would UBI be the best way to try to achieve whatever externalities there might be in public good provision, via education, etc. Why not fund that public good itself? So, this is it's a quantitative model. It's not a theory. I'm sure you can put a theory. I mean, it has a theoretical structure, obviously, but you can put a theory where it would be wonderful. But I would say it would certainly not be the direct thing to do. And I guess I would find it a little bit hard to take that part seriously. Not because I don't believe in public goods or that there's externalities, but it just seems like a very strange way to obtain those gains. But thank you. So to Marcela's question, so what we did, and this is, I think, getting at what you're saying, we did two things. One is we got rid of those transfers that existed altogether and moved to a system where we're proportionally taxing income and giving people UBI, labor income, I should say. And that does not do well. We also said, well, maybe a lot of this comes from the bureaucracy and the monitoring of things that are conditional. If we could get rid of those conditional things and move to a universal system, that might have a lot of benefits. And so what we did was to calculate by how much those costs would have to go down in order for this UBI to be welfare improving. And the answer is very, very, very implausibly large. So again, that doesn't speak to the question that you're asking for, say, the informal sector in many Latin American countries, but it is somewhat related in the sense of saying that that does not seem to be where there would be plausible gains to outweigh this. But honestly, one should do this all over again, this Latin American data. The other question of Chico, yeah, for the superstar, I mean, I do not recall, and I'm not sure we looked at how much of the reduction in hours work come from the very top. I doubt that it comes very much from the top, and it is a superstar shock. This is in the tradition of Rios Rule and co-authors. It's a trick to try to match the top of the distribution, which is very hard to match otherwise. So I don't think that the way that we're doing this is responsible for the negative results of UBI. And in fact, you could argue the opposite, because you could argue, well, these people are going to have less of, if you have to make an effort to get into the superstar state, maybe people are going to have less of an incentive, etc. Here, the way that everything has been done, that probability of entering the superstar state, the probability of exiting, and the income of which you exit on average, that remains unchanged when we introduce UBI. Your question in terms of would it be good to have these, to have more single mothers than staying at home with their kids? I'm not sure. It's true that we do not have time. We used to, actually. The model became very cumbersome. It takes 2 weeks to run the model as it is. So putting time made things difficult. And the time data was not very good in terms of differentials across different types of parents. It's certainly something that one would want to take into account, though, if you think that the time and the education of the parent who is putting in time matters to early childhood skill accumulation. Again, what I can say is that the model for the bottom fraction of the population does do well in answering the question, if I give you an extra $1,000, by how much empirically are your child's skills going to increase when your child is older? And it doesn't seem, I mean, it does increase, it increases in line with the literature. So I'm not sure that having omitted time is really going to change those results, because doing it all with money, I think we have what we need there to get the results that are in line with the empirical literature, but I could definitely be wrong. So those are my answers.
Okay, thank you very much, Raquel, for a very interesting talk. Please join me in thanking Raquel Fernandez. And please enjoy your lunch.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Raquel. Thank you.
Bye.